The training hall was quiet except for the faint scrape of metal against stone. As she knelt on the cold floor, her fingers moving over the edge of the knife with a practiced ease, the blade glimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, but she did not flinch or hesitate, as if the steel were nothing more than a simple tool in her hand. Soldiers passed by her, ignoring the calm figure. Some whispered among themselves, wondering who she was, where she came from, and why she seemed so unshakable. The sergeant leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes narrowing as he watched her movements, noting the precision of her grip, the angle of her strokes, and the way her shoulders remained steady. Not a flicker of tension betrayed her presence. His gaze flicked to the blade, and then froze. There were marks carved along the steel, fine, not random scratches, but deliberate tallies, each one perfectly spaced and etched as if they represented something only she could remember. The sergeant felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen such markings before in classified reports from past missions, tales of operatives whose knives carried stories of lives taken silently and efficiently. He glanced around the hall. No one else seemed to notice the marks, and the thought made him uneasy. She was blending in, yet holding a history he could barely comprehend. He shifted his weight and tried to speak to her casually, but found himself tongue-tied as her eyes lifted briefly, meeting his with a calmness that unnerved him. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, and returned to her work, the silence of her actions more commanding than any words could have been. The soldiers nearby continued their routines, unaware of the tension building in the corner of the room. The sergeant could feel it in his chest, a tightness, a warning that this woman was not ordinary, that her presence carried weight and danger hidden beneath the surface. Each pass of the sharpening stone over the blade seemed to echo in the hall as if it were recording the moments of her life, silently tallying the past in a code only she understood. The sergeant forced himself to look away briefly, but curiosity dragged his eyes back to the knife. The marks seemed to glint faintly under the lights, each one a testament to a mission, a life, a choice made in the shadow of conflict. He wanted to ask her the questions, but instinct told him some answers were dangerous, some knowledge could not be uncovered too quickly. And just as he considered moving closer to speak, the sound of a distant footstep in the corridor made him pause. His heart quickened. He turned sharply, wondering if she had heard it too and what it might signify. The sergeant remained still, his eyes fixed on her as she slowly rose from the floor, the knife still resting lightly in her hand, each mark along the blade catching the light and making him uneasy. Soldiers moved past them, chatting and laughing, unaware of the silent storm brewing in the corner of the hall. She walked with effortless grace, her movements smooth as if rehearsed countless times, yet there was a weight to her presence that commanded attention without a word. The sergeant took a cautious step closer, his mind racing with questions he could not ask yet could not ignore. The marks on the knife seemed to call to him, a history written in steel, tallying missions and lives that belonged to shadows and secrecy. He remembered seeing such marks in old mission reports, the stories of operatives sent behind enemy lines and returning silent or not at all. His stomach tightening as he considered the possibility that she was one of them. She noticed his gaze for the first time, lifting her eyes and holding them with a calm intensity that made his throat dry. The faintest curve of her lips hinted at amusement at his surprise, or perhaps at the unspoken recognition of her own story. He tried to speak, but the words felt inadequate, the presence of her past pressing down silently between them. The sergeant knew instinctively that she had survived situations no ordinary soldier could endure, each mark a tally of efficiency and survival. He swallowed hard, trying to mask the unease creeping through him. As she walked past him and moved toward the far end of the hall, her steps were measured but carried a confidence that unsettled everyone nearby. He noticed the subtle way her hands adjusted the knife, as if it were part of her body, a natural extension of her skill and experience. No one dared approach her, and those who glanced her way could not explain the sudden tightness in their chests. The sergeant's mind raced, imagining what each mark represented, the lives taken, the missions executed, and the silent sacrifices made. She paused briefly at a training station, her head tilting slightly, as if listening for something only she could perceive. The sergeant felt a chill. He realized that the calm, casual manner of handling the knife was deceptive. It masked an intensity that could erupt at any moment, and he wondered what she had already done, and what she might do next. The sound of a door opening at the far end of the hall drew his attention. She turned slightly toward it, the blade in her hand shifting subtly in the light, and the sergeant felt a warning deep inside him. The tallies on the steel told a story that was far from over, and he did not know if anyone present would survive the truths they were about to face. The woman moved toward the training area, her steps silent yet deliberate, the knife glinting faintly in her hand, as if it had its own life. The soldiers paused momentarily, noticing her calm efficiency, but quickly returned to their tasks, unaware of the tension that radiated from her presence. The sergeant followed at a distance, his eyes never leaving the blade, the marks along its edge haunting reminders of unknown missions and hidden battles. He wondered how someone so young could carry such experience and what kind of past could carve its story so clearly into steel. Every movement she made seemed to speak a language only he could understand, a subtle warning, and a silent history intertwined in the way she adjusted her grip or tilted her head. The hall felt smaller, somehow the shadows stretching longer, as if reacting to her presence. He wanted to approach her again to demand answers, but instinct held him back. There were some stories too dangerous to uncover too quickly. She paused briefly at a workstation, her gaze flicking toward a row of weapons neatly arranged nearby, and the sergeant noticed a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if she were remembering places and faces long buried. Each mark on the knife told a story of efficiency and survival, a tally of victories and losses, a chronicle of nights spent in silence carrying out orders that no one could speak of. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, his chest tightening as he tried to imagine the missions that had earned each mark. The air seemed to thicken around her presence, the calm confidence she exuded making ordinary soldiers shift uneasily in their positions. She lifted the blade slightly, turning it in her hand, the light catching the edges of the carved marks, and the sergeant felt a chill. The stories they told were alive, even now whispering warnings he could not ignore. He wondered what kind of person could carry such a past and still move with such apparent ease in this ordinary setting, and whether her calm was a mask for something darker and more dangerous. The sound of a distant door opening caused her to glance over her shoulder briefly, her movements smooth and controlled as always, and the sergeant realized that she was listening to things he could not hear, sensing threats before they appeared. He stepped closer, trying to appear casual, but his curiosity burned inside him. He needed to know who she was, what those marks meant, and whether the history they represented would reach into this room tonight, leaving consequences none of them could anticipate. The woman paused at the far end of the hall, her knife resting lightly in her hand, as if it weighed nothing yet carried the weight of countless untold stories. The sergeant kept his distance, his eyes fixed on her every motion, each mark on the blade, a silent testimony to missions executed with lethal precision. She looked over the row of training dummies, her gaze lingering on one in particular, as if measuring an unseen enemy. The soldiers nearby continued their exercises, oblivious to the tension that thickened the air. He remembered stories he had heard whispered in briefing rooms about operatives whose knives carried the memory of lives taken silently and efficiently, and he felt a chill at the thought that she might be one of them. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and controlled. Every step measured, her breathing steady, her eyes scanning the room for threats invisible to everyone else. The sergeant tried to read her expression, but it was a mask, calm, composed, and unreadable, hiding the shadow of her past. Each tally on the knife seemed to pulse with a life of its own, telling tales of stealth and danger, of nights spent moving through enemy territory and returning with nothing but the silence of success. She adjusted her grip on the blade ever so slightly, and the faint scrape of metal echoed through the hall like a warning that could only be felt, not heard. The sergeant swallowed hard, knowing that what lay behind those marks could not be uncovered quickly. Some truths were too dangerous, and some histories too dark to confront without risk. He could sense her awareness extending beyond the room, as if she was listening for movements no one else could perceive. Her eyes flicked to the windows at the edge of the hall, then back to the training dummies, and he realized that every motion was a rehearsal of battles fought long before this moment, and perhaps battles yet to come. The soldiers around them remained unaware of the storm of skill and history moving silently among them. The sergeant took a cautious step closer, drawn by curiosity and fear at once, wondering how many of the tallies represented missions that should have ended lives, and how many represented battles she had survived alone. She turned slightly toward him, a faint smile brushing her lips like a shadow, and in that instant, he felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing down. The knife in her hand was no longer just a tool, it was a ledger of the past and a warning of what might be coming. And then a sudden noise from the corridor made him snap his head toward the source, wondering if it was a threat or the beginning of something far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. The alarm sounded faintly in the distance, but she did not flinch, her eyes remaining sharp and alert, as if listening to things no one else could perceive. The soldiers around her hesitated, unsure of what to do, while she moved with fluid precision, each step measured, each motion calculated. She approached the first obstacle in the training course, and with a single motion neutralized it before anyone else could react. The sergeant watched in stunned silence, recognizing the lethal efficiency in her movements. The knife in her hand glimmered faintly under the lights, each mark along the steel telling the story of past missions, lives taken and threats eliminated. He realized that her calm demeanor was deceptive, masking a skill set honed in places no ordinary recruit could survive. She advanced further, the hall narrowing around her, the tension rising with every step, as if the walls themselves sensed the presence of someone extraordinary. The soldiers tried to follow her lead, but they stumbled her. Shadow seemed to move ahead of her, anticipating the course, adjusting before the threat even appeared. The sergeant felt a tightness in his chest, every motion of hers a reminder that the history etched into that blade was not distant, it was alive and present, and it could strike at any moment. She paused, briefly assessing the next obstacle, her eyes scanning like a predator sizing up prey. She moved with silence and speed, dismantling threats with a grace that seemed almost unreal. The sergeant stepped closer, unwilling to let his fear show but unable to stop himself from watching the display of deadly competence. He wondered how many of those marks on her knife represented experiences that no one in the room could imagine, each tally a whisper of life and death situations survived. She moved toward a corner of the hall, and a sudden shadow flickered across her path. Without hesitation, she adjusted the knife in her hand and neutralized the unseen danger before anyone else had even noticed it. The soldiers froze. The sergeant felt a chill, realizing the knife was more than a weapon. It was a record of skill, a ledger of survival, and a warning that this woman was not to be underestimated. He wanted to ask her the questions that burned in his mind, but instinct told him to wait, to observe, to learn the limits of her abilities first. She turned toward him, a faint smile brushing her lips like the ghost of a secret he could not decipher, and then the distant sound of a door slamming echoed through the hall, signaling that the first real test of her skill was only beginning, and the consequences of what was to come would be far greater than anyone present could imagine. The sudden clatter from the far end of the hall made everyone freeze, but she did not flinch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if reading the movement before it even happened. The sergeant felt a tightness in his chest, recognizing the silent warning. She radiated her presence, commanding attention. Without a word, she shifted her weight, subtly adjusting the knife in her hand, each mark along the blade glinting faintly in the light like a record of untold battles. He watched as she moved toward the source of the sound with a calm precision that made the soldiers around her instinctively step back. She reached the corner and paused, her gaze scanning the shadows, her senses alert to every detail no one else could detect. The sergeant felt a chill, realizing that she was aware of threats they had not even perceived. Her movements were deliberate yet fluid, dismantling obstacles and potential danger with a skill that seemed unnatural for someone so young. He tried to imagine the missions behind each mark on the knife, the tally of lives taken, the silent victories, the losses endured in the shadows. He swallowed hard, knowing that each mark represented experiences no ordinary soldier could survive. She turned slightly toward the sergeant, her eyes meeting his briefly, and he felt the weight of unspoken truths, the calmness in her expression masking a storm of deadly competence. She advanced slowly toward the training dummies that lined the hall, her movements precise, calculating, anticipating unseen threats. As if the room itself obeyed her awareness, every obstacle she faced was neutralized before it could challenge her, each motion a testament to efficiency and survival. Her presence alone shifted the energy in the hall, the soldiers unsure whether to follow or flee. The sergeant realized that her knife was not merely a weapon, it was a ledger of her past, a chronicle of experiences that could not be ignored. She paused, briefly listening to the faintest sound of movement in the distance, then adjusted her stance, the knife now a blur of readiness. His pulse quickened, knowing that any confrontation could escalate at a moment's notice. She moved with silent intent, dismantling threats before they appeared. The soldiers around her, realizing with growing awe that the history etched in steel was alive and present, and the danger it represented was only now beginning to make itself known. The sergeant stepped closer, knowing he could not intervene but also could not look away. Every motion she made a reminder that the quiet presence he had observed was anything but ordinary, and that the true story behind the knife was only beginning to unfold, and the consequences would reach farther than anyone in the hall could imagine. The sergeant felt a chill as she moved toward the far side of the hall, the knife in her hand glinting faintly under the harsh lights, each mark along the steel a silent testimony to missions carried out in shadows. Her eyes scanned the room with a predator-like focus, the soldiers around her instinctively stepping back, unsure whether to follow or freeze in place. The distant sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, and she shifted her stance slightly, adjusting the grip on the knife as if anticipating an enemy. Only she could perceive the sergeant wanted to call out to her, to ask questions about the tallies on the blade, but the instinct in his chest told him some histories could not be spoken aloud, some truths were too dangerous to confront directly. She moved closer to the row of training dummies, her presence commanding the space around her with an authority that seemed unnatural for a new recruit. Each motion was precise, every movement deliberate and calculated. The sergeant, realizing that what he had witnessed so far was only a fraction of her skill, the tallies etched into the knife were alive in the moment, a record of efficiency, of survival, and of silent victories that could not be measured by ordinary standards. He tried to imagine the missions behind each mark, the nights spent in enemy territory, the lives ended silently, and the dangers survived alone. The soldiers watched in awe and fear, unable to comprehend the weight of her history. She paused briefly, as if listening to The very air around her, the knife tilting slightly in her hand, catching the light and flashing the marks that recorded battles no one else could see. Her gaze met the sergeant briefly, and in that moment he understood the knife was not just a weapon, it was a ledger, a warning, and a signal that the calmness she displayed masked something far more dangerous than anyone in the hall could imagine. The footsteps grew louder, and she moved with effortless speed, dismantling the imagined threat before it could reach her, a blur of motion and control that left everyone frozen. The sergeant felt a mixture of awe and fear. He wanted answers, but he could see that none would be given freely. Each mark on the blade a story he was not yet ready to hear, and the moment stretched in tense silence, waiting for the next move, waiting for the revelation of the history she carried in steel, and the next step she would take that could change everything in the hall and leave questions hanging that no one would dare speak aloud. The sound of alarms echoed through the hall, jolting the soldiers into motion, but she remained calm, her eyes narrowing, as if assessing every detail, the knife in her hand moving almost naturally with her, as if it were part of her body. The sergeant felt a tightening in his chest, knowing that the tallies etched into the blade were not just marks of the past but warnings of the present. She advanced toward the source of the disturbance, her step silent and precise, the soldiers struggling to keep up. As chaos began to unfold around them, the distant crash of equipment and shouts of confusion reached her ears, but she did not hesitate. Her movements were fluid, a dance of deadly efficiency, the knife slicing through the air with purpose. Each obstacle she faced was neutralized before it could challenge her, and the sergeant watched in stunned awe, realizing that the blade in her hand carried more than steel, it carried history and skill earned in shadows and danger. He tried to imagine the missions behind the marks, the lives taken and threats eliminated, the nights spent in silence where every second counted and every mistake meant death. The soldiers froze as she approached a corner where the source of the attack had appeared, her eyes locking onto the unseen threat, as if seeing through walls. Her stance shifted slightly, the knife moving in her hand with a speed and precision that left the soldiers wide-eyed and fearful. She dispatched the intruder before anyone could react, a single motion. Precise, deadly, and final. The sergeant felt his heart pounding, the realization hitting him that everything the tallies represented was true and alive. In the moment, she moved through the hall like a shadow, executing moves that seemed impossible, her calm demeanor never wavering. Her knife etched a story in the chaos, a story of survival, of skill, of a life honed in the crucible of danger. The soldiers followed her movements in awe, unable to comprehend how one person could command so much control. The sergeant knew instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary and terrifying. Every mark on that blade justified and real. She paused briefly, scanning the hall, the chaos settling as she stood in the center, her presence alone commanding silence. The sergeant approached slowly, knowing there was no time for questions, yet feeling the weight of the history she carried pressing down on him. He could not ask what missions had earned each tally or what dangers she had faced alone, but he understood one thing clearly: she was not ordinary, and the knife she handled casually carried a story that would haunt them all. And the moment of calm was only temporary, because the next challenge was already coming, and they would all have to face it. The hall was quiet now, except for the distant echoes of alarms fading into silence, and the soft shuffle of soldiers regaining their bearings. She stood in the center, her knife lowered slightly, but still held with the same calm precision, each mark along the blade catching the light like a record of battles no one present had fully understood. The sergeant approached cautiously, his eyes never leaving her movements, the tension in his chest still tight from the recent chaos. He could see the faintest hint of satisfaction in her expression, as if she had anticipated the attack and executed her response flawlessly. The soldiers around her were shaken, some wide-eyed, some whispering to each other, trying to understand the display of skill they had just witnessed, but none dared speak directly to her. She turned her gaze slowly across the hall, scanning every corner, every shadow, as if measuring threats invisible to everyone else. The sergeant felt a chill, realizing that her awareness extended beyond the room, and that the tallies on her knife were not just memories, they were warnings of what she was capable of in the present. He wanted to ask questions about the marks, about the missions they represented, but instinct told him to wait, to observe, to understand. The weight she carried in silence. She moved toward a stack of training equipment, inspecting it briefly, her knife glinting in the light, each tally along the steel like a whisper of the lives and battles recorded silently over time. The soldiers followed at a cautious distance, awed and fearful of her presence and the stories they could only imagine. The sergeant stepped closer, trying to mask his curiosity with authority, but he knew it was useless. He could not hide the fascination and apprehension building inside him. He realized that she was not just skilled, she was lethal and controlled in a way that no ordinary soldier could ever be. He wondered how many missions each mark represented, how many lives taken, how many threats neutralized. Silently and efficiently her eyes flicked to him briefly, a faint smile brushing her lips, and he felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on him. He could see that the calmness she displayed was a mask for experiences he could not imagine, and that the knife in her hand was more than steel, it was a ledger of survival and skill. The soldiers around them slowly began to recover their composure, but the memory of her precision lingered in their minds like a shadow. The sergeant knew that nothing would ever be ordinary again, and that the story carried in the knife and in her calm presence was far from finished, and as she turned toward the exit he realized the final chapter was approaching, and that the truths behind those marks would not remain hidden for long. The hall was quiet now, the chaos faded, but the tension lingered like a shadow. She stood near the exit, the knife in her hand glinting faintly, each mark along the steel, a record of battles, lives taken and missions completed silently and efficiently. The soldiers around her shifted uneasily, unsure whether to speak or move. She moved with the same calm precision as before, each step measured, controlled, and deliberate. The sergeant followed at a distance, his eyes fixed on the blade, the weight of its history pressing in on him. He felt the chill of understanding that what lay behind those marks was not a story he could ever fully know. The air seemed to thicken around her presence, the room shrinking as if her skill and experience commanded it. He remembered every motion from the training hall, the way she anticipated danger before it arrived, the way the knife became an extension of her body, every tally a whisper of past missions that no one could see, yet everyone could feel. Her gaze swept across the soldiers as if reading their thoughts, measuring their fear and admiration with silent judgment. The sergeant realized the calmness she displayed was not arrogance, it was mastery earned through experiences that could kill the unprepared. She paused briefly, adjusting the knife in her hand, the marks catching the light like a warning of what was possible, and then she turned toward the exit, moving with a grace that seemed almost unreal. The soldiers watched in awe, unsure whether to follow or remain. Frozen in place, the sergeant felt a pull to ask questions, to uncover even a fraction of the history recorded in that blade, but he knew instinctively some stories could not be told without consequences. She reached the doorway, and for a moment the light caught the edge of the knife, making the tallies flash like silent messages. He felt the weight of anticipation pressing down. The story was far from over, and yet this moment was a pause, a breath before the next chapter began. The soldiers slowly realized that the woman they had watched was not ordinary, and that the knife she handled casually carried a story of survival, skill, and silent victories that would haunt them all. The sergeant stepped forward, hesitating, knowing that whatever came next could change everything, and as she walked away the faintest smile brushed her lips, leaving questions hanging like shadows across the hall, and the tallies on the steel whispered promises of danger and secrets yet to be revealed. The memory of her calm, deadly presence lingered in their minds, a warning and an awe, and as the door closed behind her the sergeant understood that the story of the marks on the blade was not finished, it had only begun, and the next moment could arrive at any time without warning, leaving them to wonder what history she would carve next.